Hi, fourth grade. We are starting a new read aloud book today. It's called There's an Owl in the Shower, and it's by Jean Craighead George. Okay, let's go ahead and start the book. So chapter 1. And if you're wondering, there's an owl in the shower. Yes, it's a picture of a shower, and there's an owl in it. Okay, we're all on the same page. Here we go. Okay, I'm going to show a quick picture. So, on the title page, there's this beautiful picture of this really huge tree and 3 little people standing below the tree. So that's kind of the title page. Just want to make sure everybody can see that. Okay, here we go. On the dedication page, it says, to the members of the Willow Creek Northern Spotted Owl Study, Rocky, Alan, Chris, and Peter. And this is our main character, 2 of our main characters. So if you're live or if you're watching the video, you can kind of see this is who we're about to learn about. Okay, here we go. Chapter 1. Borden Watson braked his bike and jumped off. He wheeled it across the narrow logging road and into the dark forest. Leaning it against a tree, he took his rifle from its carrier and put a bullet in the chamber. A cool green silence wrapped around him. He breathed deeply, then stepped onto the needle-carpeted ground and walked a soundless distance. Ankle deep in ferns and wildflowers, he stopped in a grove of trees. The trees were so enormous that one alone, standing in the middle of the logging road, could block trucks in 2 directions. Borden was in the old-growth forest of a Pacific coast in Northern California, a land blessed with abundant rain and sun, a temperate climate, and deep soils. He did not see this wild wealth. He was in the old-growth forest for one purpose: to shoot owls, spotted owls. He hated them. His eyes cruised up the trunk of an enormous Douglas fir. They peered past the large, low branches, up past a floral burst of limbs where a pine siskin cheeped, and on up to a cluster of needles 200 feet above the forest floor. Just below the needle spray was a large nest of sticks. He grinned. "You," he said aloud. "You owl in that nest. You're dead the minute you stick your head up." It was almost twilight, and the owl, Borden reasoned, should be awake and ready to go out hunting. He thought about his father and cried out, "My dad doesn't have a job because of you. He can't cut any more big trees because of you." Shouting seemed to help the pain Borden had felt since his father had lost his job with the lumber company. His father had told him that a judge had stopped all sale of the trees on public lands in the Northwest until the United States Forest Service could come up with a plan to save the spotted owl. It lived in the old-growth forests, and the forests were being cut down for lumber. The gentle owl was on the brink of extinction. The government, it seemed to Borden, liked owls better than people. Borden thought about this and grew angrier. "He's the best tree cutter from here north through Canada to Alaska," he shouted to the bird in the nest hole. "He can put a giant tree right down on the earth without hitting a single tree around it. He can do that." He lifted his rifle. He had more to say. "He's the best of the cutters, and the cutters are the most important people in the whole lumber business. And their work is very, very dangerous. Limbs and trees can fall and kill or injure them. They have to be smart people." He paused, then went on. "My pop is famous. He won the National Tree Cutters Award." He smiled pridefully, then remembered. "But because of you, he can't work." Borden caught his breath and thought about what he had just said. He didn't not understand why a little owl could stop honest, hard-working men like his father from cutting down trees. But it had happened. Now his father was out of work, and it was painful for the whole Watson family. His mother had been forced to take a job in the school cafeteria. Borden had mowed lawns to help out, but that was only in the summer. Through the winter and into late spring, he too was out of work. Sally, his older sister, with her pale blue eyes and bush of red stringy curls, was also upset. She had stopped playing soccer with her friends, and every day except Tuesdays came home right after school. She would go to her room and close the door. She wouldn't talk about spotted owls when Borden and his father ranted against them. Borden suspected she was embarrassed that Pop didn't have a job. She didn't need to be. She could be angry, maybe, but not embarrassed. Many fathers were out of work in the lumber town of Fresta. Stores had closed, and businesses and lumber companies had failed. Almost everyone was suffering, but that did not seem to matter to Sally. She went on soothing her hurt behind her closed door. Borden did not criticize her. He understood why she felt as she did. Their father was Leon Watson, big, noisy, protective. They thought nothing could happen to him, but it had, and that was very upsetting. A hero had been felled by a measly little bird. All spring, Borden thought up plans to get his father's job back. None were any good. He just didn't understand why an owl could stop a man like his pop from cutting down trees. When Judge Kramer came down the street on his way to the post office one school morning, Borden caught up to him and put the question to him. "There's a law," said the impeccably dressed judge, adjusting his tie. "It's called the Endangered Species Act. It states that no one can destroy threatened and endangered creatures or the habitats they live in. If they do, they will be fined, put in jail, or both." He looked at Borden. "Our northern spotted owl is a threatened species. He can only live in old-growth forests and nest in big, tall trees. When we cut them down, he dies." Borden thought about that. Judge Kramer continued. "The problem is this. The agencies that take care of our public lands, the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, violated the nation's environmental laws. They permitted lumber companies to cut recklessly and too fast. The owls are being wiped off the face of the earth. Mountainsides are eroding. A judge in Seattle ordered all timber sales, and therefore cutting, to stop until there is a workable plan to save the owl." "We're going to save the owl, not the people?" Borden asked. "The owl is telling the people that we aren't managing our forests right. Save the owl, and you save the people too. We need forests." His heel tapped the sidewalk like the tick of a clock. In some places, in Washington State, only 6 pairs of spotted owls remain on 6 million acres of old growth that were cut down in the past. That's trouble for the owls and trouble for us. Can't the owls move? They can't. When the big trees are gone, the owls will die. But Pop's company leaves some big trees for the owls. "Too far apart," said the judge. "The owls can't hear each other, and if they can't hear each other, they can't find each other, and if they can't find each other, they can't mate. And if they can't mate, no more owls." Borden frowned. "It's a terrible thing no matter how you look at it," Judge Kramer said. "Cut the trees, and the owls become extinct. Stop felling them, and the cutters become extinct," said Borden. "And that's terrible." For the next week, Borden put his mind once more to solving the problem of owls, trees, and cutters. To think more clearly, he rode his bike out to the Trinity River after school and climbed up on his favorite rock. He decided the lumber companies should cut the trees anyway. Once the trees were down, no one could put them back up, so the mills might as well sell them. Then he remembered that Judge Kramer had said anyone who destroyed the homeland of a threatened species would be fined or put in jail. And he thought again. The next day, he was biking through the little flower-filled park in the middle of town when he braked to a stop. A spotted owl hung by its neck from a lamppost. "Ah, now there's a good owl," he said. Borden saw what must be done. It was that simple. He headed out for the mountains. Here's a picture I'm going to show of Borden. So here's Borden. Okay. Let's go ahead and pause for a moment. So that was the end of chapter 1. I hope the volume works. If you're watching the recording, I'm going to let a couple kids unmute and comment on chapter 1 so far. So bear with me, kids on the recording, and hopefully you can hear us. Okay, so 4th grade, those of you who are here for the live lesson, can someone just really quickly summarize for me? Go ahead and raise a hand. Who are the characters? What is the setting? And what's the action happening right now? Who wants to kind of tackle that? Okay, Matthew, I saw your hand first. Matthew, what's the setting? Where does this book take place? Do you remember where it said this book takes place?
Wait, I can't hear you. Glitched out. Can you say it again?
Oh, yeah, no problem. Where does this book take place? What's the setting?
Oh, yeah. So the setting is Canada, and, it's in the forest, his home, and in the mountains.
Mm-hmm. And you're close with Canada. There was a line about Canada in this book. He said he's the best tree cutter from here north through Canada to Alaska. But does anyone remember the exact, where is the specific location in the United States that it said at the beginning? Which state?
I forgot.
That's okay, Matthew. We'll come back to that. Matthew, tell us who the characters are before you go. Who are the main characters?
Borden, his father, and his sister.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so those are the characters we've met. Thanks, Matthew. You can go ahead and mute. Carolyn, I saw your hand. Do you remember the setting?
In, California?
Yeah, California. The Pacific Coast in Northern California. So there's a lot of rain, a lot of sun, deep soils. The climate there is pretty mild. So yeah, thanks, Carolyn. So now we kind of know where the story's happening. We know who the story's about. And Oscar, what is Borden's deal? How does Borden feel? This book starts off with intense emotion. Go ahead and unmute, Oscar. What's the feeling of chapter 1?
My video conference.
That's okay. We can hear you. Go ahead, Oscar.
So, he feels really angry about the owls and how they put his dad out of business. And now he just wants to shoot owls.
Yeah, he wants to kill these animals that are the reason why his dad doesn't have a job. He's super angry and sad and upset. Thank you, Oscar. Okay, you can go ahead and mute. Guys, let's read another chapter. Let's go ahead and read one more chapter. So, chapter 2 is called Enrique. Here we go. Borden leaned against a young fir tree and recalled the owl hanging from the lamppost. It had bright white spots and walnut brown feathers. Easy to identify. He smiled. He was a good shot. A woodpecker drilled to his left. He listened to the rapid hammering. Overhead, a small flock of golden-crowned kinglets sang a series of thin, wiry notes, then chattered softly. Borden thought their voices sounded more like the wind brushing the needles than birdsong. He wanted to look at them, but dared not. He must keep his eyes on the nest. "Owl," he said aloud. Come on out. I know you're in there. My pop showed me your home last year. He said the Cutters call you Enrique. You took my pop's job. Well, I'm going to fix that. He could not say more. The words coming out were crinkled with emotion. A black-tailed deer got to her feet in a grove of ferns. She saw Borden and stood tree-still. Gingerly, she sniffed the air, then caught the scent of him and bolted. Borden turned in time to see her vanish into a swatch of rhododendrons. Borden looked back at the nest and fingered the trigger on his gun. Some distance away in a Douglas fir at the edge of the logging road, an owl awoke. He was red-brown from head to toe, chunky, and about 1.5 feet tall. He looked more like a redwood stump than an owl. The owl shook, and a cloud of dust from the logging road puffed out from him. He shook again. Another cloud appeared, and then one more. When the dust was gone, there sat a beautiful spotted owl. He was reminiscent of the stars in a midnight sky. 2 black holes were his eyes. Around his face, dark feathers formed a heart-shaped disc that swept sound to his ears. White eyebrows reflected light into his eyes. He was Enrique, devoted father, great hunter, and one of a few remaining northern spotted owls. He turned his head slowly from side to side, not so much to see, but to listen. Then he ran his beak down the rachis, or hollow barrel, of a wing feather. He pulled it far back and let go. It snapped into place noiselessly. Soft edges along this and all his flight feathers muted their sound. He flew in silence. Enrique swung his head back and forth, then up and down, as he listened to the music of the forest. Here's a picture of Enrique. Here's Enrique. Pretty cool. One ear was lower than the other, giving him sound vision, sharper than an eagle's eyes. He heard crickets and twittering birds, and finally, by turning his head, he heard his highway through the tree limbs. Spreading his wings, Enrique soared off, maneuvering among the twigs and branches by sound. Borden heard nothing as Enrique passed overhead and alighted on the limb above the nest. "Hoo, hoo, 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 hoo," the bird called to his mate. She was brooding their 2 owlets in the deep center of the stick nest that had been built years ago by a hawk and taken over by Enrique and his mate of many years. Borden clicked off the safety on his rifle. That small sound reached Enrique. The spotted owl is required to have ears that are eyes. Enrique lived high in the forest canopy and hunted for creatures who romped in the fog and mist more than 100 feet below. He saw Borden through that click that his gun made, then brought him into focus with his eyes and sat still. Borden circled the tree, peering into the high limbs. After a brief search, he saw the roundish owl shape. Quickly, he aimed, holding his breath so he would not jerk when he pulled the trigger. Then, for some reason, he hesitated, and in that instant, the owl faded from sight. It was too dark. "Rats," he said. He climbed slowly up the steep ravine in the darkness and found his bike. Wheeling it out onto the road, he turned and looked into the gray-black owl grove. "I'll be back," he said. He wheeled off down the mountain road toward his home in the lumber town of Fresta on the Trinity River. The town was 30 miles inland from the Pacific Ocean in the Trinity National Forest. Enrique listened until Borden rounded the bend and sped away. The gunman gone, he concentrated on finding food. He rotated his head almost all the way over his back. His ears were tapping into the sound waves from flying squirrels, deer mice, and wood rats. Here's a picture of Borden on his bike, getting ready to go home. Leaving empty-handed, he was not able to shoot Enrique. He hesitated for one moment, and Enrique got away. Enrique could also hear the gap in the forest where a group of ancient Douglas firs and incense cedars had been cut down by Borden's father and his crew. The empty space whistled and whined. From a distance came a vaster sound. It was created by the treeless north side of the mountain. The cutters had clear-cut here, sawing down every tree, big and small, until the mountainside was bare. With them went Enrique's hunting perches and food supply. He was forced to search farther from home. He was wide awake now. He floated down to the limb beside his nest and called softly. 2 owlets thrust their heads out from under their mother's wings and screamed. Their raspy hunger calls drove Enrique onto his wings, and he flew off to hunt for them. Enrique had to feed not only the owlets, but also his mate. She could not leave their young. They had recently hatched and were scantily feathered. At the top of the giant trees, the air was either too cold or too hot for the owlets. The females stayed with them for at least 2 weeks after their hatching to brood and regulate their temperatures. Enrique alighted on the branch of an ancient Douglas fir 4 miles away. It stood in several hundred acres of old-growth forest, part of his 5 square miles of home range. The flying squirrels were plentiful here. Enrique lifted the feathers over his ears and let in the sounds. He heard barred owl nestlings snapping their beaks in a hollow in the tree where he sat. Then, like a sword-edged wind, the mother barred owl rocketed down upon him. Talons spread, she boomed her tiger call. Barred owls look very much like spotted owls, with their solid black eyes and pale horizontal markings, and are often confused with them. They are more aggressive than spotted owls, however, and take over their trees and home range. Chainsaws and barred owls were making Enrique's task of providing food for his family very difficult. Enrique took off. He soared over a clear-cut mountainside to another old-growth forest, where he caught a flying squirrel. He carried it back to his mate to share with the owlets. He returned the long distance and hunted until dawn. He caught only 1 more squirrel. The owlets were still calling for food when daylight sent him back to his roost above the logging road. At sunrise, the huge logging trucks rolled up the mountain and passed through the public lands where Enrique lived. They were on their way to the privately owned forests of the logging companies. These forests were managed by their owners to produce crops of trees in the same way that farmers raise wheat and corn. The trees were cut and seedlings were planted. Some 75 years in the future, they would be harvested. The logging ban did not apply to the private forests. The trucks passed below Enrique, stirring up the dust, and by noon, he looked like a redwood stump again. Okay, 4th grade, that is the end of chapter 2. If you were watching the recording, tune in tomorrow for chapter 3, possibly chapter 4 as well, and we'll see you soon, but hopefully you enjoyed the beginning of our next read aloud book. See you later.